12 stones and the Joshua generation. Doesn't it sound like a 60s or 70s musical group? 12 stones and the Joshua generation. In your bulletin, you should find a blank index card. So make sure you have that, because we're going to see that in a little bit. When we last left, we had Joshua and the Israelites standing on the west bank of the Jordan River, and the priest who had been standing there forever in the middle of the river, and we just kind of left them there. We left the priest right in the middle of the river. We're going to continue to go into Joshua this morning. We're going to go to Joshua chapter 4. Oh, you want this. This will help you. You'll know where I am. Nope, that's not it. Oh, you got it. James was like, Dad, the last couple weeks you haven't given me the script. And I was like, I was going by myself. But Joshua 3:17 says this. And this is where we kind of left this last week. Meanwhile, the priests who were carrying the ark of the Lord's covenant stood on dry ground in the middle of the riverbed as soon as the people passed by. They waited there until the whole nation of Israel had crossed the Jordan on dry ground. And so we have the priest standing in the middle of the riverbed. But before we get there, you've got your 355 card. Have you been doing your homework this week? Have you been praying for 5 families? And I knew I was going to have to ask this question. The Lord kept reminding me, probably about a dozen times this week. God said, Dale, you're going to get up in front of the congregation and you're going to ask them if they've been praying for those 5 young families. Have you? And so immediately, as soon as God spoke to me, I'd pray. So I've done it at least a dozen times, because God kept reminding me, hey, don't forget to pray for those 5 young families. And so like I said, we left the priest standing in the middle of the river. And the Israelites were finally getting ready to occupy the land of the promised land. And in Exodus 23:31, we are given a taste of how big that area was. Here it is. And I will fix your boundaries from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, and from the eastern wilderness to the Euphrates River. I will hand over to you the people now living in the land, and you will drive them out ahead of you. Now, has anybody ever really wondered how big the land the Israelites were to occupy? Now, when we typically think of the land that they are going to occupy, bring up that first map, we typically think of this area that we now know as Israel. Here's the Dead Sea, here's the Sea of Galilee, and so we often think that this here, right along the Mediterranean shore and down to the Red Sea, which is poking right here at the bottom, that's the promised land. But I was doing some research this week, and this wasn't the first time that this has come up in conversation. I talked to a layperson several years ago when we were living in Virginia, and he says, do you realize how big the promised land was? Go ahead, Anna, put that next slide up. Whoa! The whole Sinai Peninsula, a good section of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, into modern day Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, all that area was the greater border. And then I saw another one that even took a guess that it was this big. Well, now we've got all that what we already had, and you add most of Turkey. That was the land that God gave to the Israelites. We're going to talk a little bit about more about it as we go today. I mean, you say, well, Pastor, wait, Dale, the priests are still standing in the water. And so they are. Well, not standing in the water, but they're standing in the middle of the river. And that water is backing up. This is the way it kind of eventually ended up. You have all the 12 tribes of Israel are up there. That's the land that they ended up occupying. So Joshua chapter 4. When all the people had crossed the Jordan, the Lord said to them, Joshua, now choose 12 men, one from each tribe, and tell them, take 12 stones from the very place where the priests are standing in the middle of the river Jordan. Carry them out and pile them up to a place where you will camp tonight." So Joshua called together the 12 men he had chosen, one from each of the tribes of Israel, and he told them, "Go into the middle of the Jordan, in front of the ark of the Lord your God, and each of you must pick up one stone and carry it on your shoulder." Now, what do you think about that? What size stone are we talking about? Are we just talking about, just a little stone? No, we're talking about boulders and putting them on your shoulder and carrying them out of the river. Big stones. "We will use these stones to build a memorial, and in the future, when your children ask you," this is really important, "what do these stones mean?" then you can tell them, "They remind us that the Jordan River stopped flowing when the Ark of the Lord's covenant went across. These stones will stand as a memorial among the people of Israel forever." So the men did as Joshua commanded them. They took 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan River, one for each tribe, just as the Lord had told Joshua. They carried them to the place where they camped for the night and constructed the memorial there. Imagine having to carry those stones to where they camped. Who knows how far it was? So Joshua piled up another set of stones in the middle of the Jordan. Did you know that there were 2 memorials? It was several years ago when I came across that there was actually 2 memorials. There's one that they set up in the middle of the Jordan, and then another one where they camped out at the place where the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant were standing, and they are there to this day. The priests who were carrying the Ark stood in the middle of the river until all of the Lord's commands that Moses had given to Joshua carried out. And meanwhile, the people hurried across the riverbed. And when everyone was safely to the other side, the priests crossed over and with the Ark of the Lord as the people watched. The armed warriors from the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh led the Israelites across the Jordan just as Moses had directed. These armed men, about 40,000 strong, were ready for battle, and the Lord was with them as they crossed over to the plains of Jericho. That day, the Lord made Joshua a great leader in the eyes of all the Israelites, and for the rest of his life, they revered him as much as they revered Moses. The Lord said to Joshua, "Command the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant to come out of the riverbed." So Joshua gave the command, and as soon as the priests carried the Ark of the Lord's Covenant, came out of the riverbed, and their feet were on high ground, the water of the Jordan returned and overflowed its banks as before. The people crossed the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they camped at Gilgal, just east of Jericho. It was there at Gilgal that Joshua piled up the 12 stones taken from the Jordan River. Then Joshua said to the Israelites, "In the future, when your children will ask, 'What do these stones mean?' then you can tell them, 'This is where the Israelites crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the river right before your eyes, and he kept it dry until you were all across, just as he did at the Red Sea when he dried it up, until you all had crossed over. He did this so that all the nations of the earth might know that the Lord's hand is powerful, so that you might fear the Lord your God forever." So the Israelites crossed the Jordan River. And the priests with the Ark of the Covenant are still standing in the middle of the dry river. I have no idea how long the priests stood in the middle of the river, because remember, they had to step in the water, and then God backed up the water 20 miles to the north. So it took a little while for that water to get down there. So they're standing in the water. All this time, they're standing with the Ark of the Covenant. Now, what do you remember about the Ark of the Covenant? What happens if they would slip and they touched the Ark of the Covenant? They die. All right, think about stepping into a flooded river. Now, what's at the bottom of a flooded river? Slimy rocks, right? Okay, do you see where I'm going with this? It took a lot of faith to step into a flooded river with slimy rocks with death on your shoulder. It was the Ark of the Covenant, but it was, if they touched it, they were done. Now, they're standing in the middle of the river. They're waiting for the river to dry up. Finally, the river dries up, and now they've got to wait for 6 million people to cross over the river. 6 million people is going to take a little while. So they're standing there, they're standing there, they're standing there. Finally, 6 million people get ready, and they're like, okay, God, Joshua's going to finally call us out of the river. Joshua, well, hold on just a minute. We're not done yet. Joshua, just get on with the program. Let's get going. Let's move in. Joshua says, we've got to do something. So he tells them, okay, 12 guys, 12 tribe leaders, you go grab the stones. And the priest is like, okay, now we're good. Now Joshua gets back into the riverbed, and he piles up 12 more stones. Like, Joshua, come on. Let's get on with the program. Let's move on. Finally, Joshua gets up on the dry bank. He says, all right, priests, come on up. They come on up. They get out of the water, and the water starts flowing again. Why is it so important to remember what God did? Why did Joshua make such a big deal about this? Why did we make such a big deal about the 80th anniversary? Listen to these words that God tells Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 6. You must love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and all your strength. And you must commit yourselves wholeheartedly to these commands that I am giving you today. Repeat them again and again to your children. Talk about them when you're at home and when you're on the road and when you're going to bed and when you're getting up. And tie them to your hands and wear them on your forehead as reminders. Write them on your doorpost of your house and on your gates. When were they supposed to remind each other that they should love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength? All the time. All the time. All the time. Put them on as a reminder. And so, I think this really speaks. When we think of this idea of this 12-stone memorial, the importance of telling God's story to the next generation. Not only do we need to tell the story, but we need to make sure that the story becomes real in their lives. Because there's one thing that I know that we can't do. We cannot live out the faith of our children as much as we would like to. We cannot live out the faith of our children and our grandchildren. That faith has to be their own. But God does command us to nurture that faith. He commands us to disciple that faith, and He tells us that we need to do that for each generation. Even now, it's fun. Now, this used to happen a lot when Rebecca was home, and we used to get in the car and drive, and we used to have these deep theological conversations. And even now, we, as a family, when we're driving somewhere, we'll talk about things of God. We'll talk about what it means to live a life of discipleship and a life of faith. And because one of the things I know is the very best discipleship, the very best place to do discipleship is in the home. Now, we have a generation of people who don't know, the parents don't know Jesus, and certainly the children. So where's the next best place to do that? It's to do it here. Disciple people. Joshua says to the Israelite, in the future, when your children ask, what do these stones mean? Tell them, this is where the Lord dried up the river. This is where the Lord did His mighty act. He dried up the river, and then He dried up the Red Sea for our parents. Why? Why did God do these things? So that the nations of the earth may know that the Lord's hand is powerful. And more importantly for us this morning, that you might fear the Lord your God forever. And I believe that's not a fear God as in the way we might fear a mouse. Or in Dawn's case, a snake. You'll have to tell her that I said that. What's that? Spiders. Oh, I'm sorry, spiders. That's right, spiders. That's not the kind of fear we're talking about. That's not the way we fear the Lord. But the way we fear the Lord is saying, wow, what an awesome God He is. And I want to serve Him for who He is. And so, and we want to tell other people about this awesome God that we serve and the things that we do. I read that passage in Joshua chapter 4 at the very beginning of our picnic. And then on Sunday morning when Pastor Joey was here, he told the story of how McCray Brook Church got started as a Sunday school. And 3 years later became an established church with the help of the Olean Church. And I still never forget telling the reporter who was here from the Bradford Era about the story of the dedicated people, the dedicated person who would get up at dawn and right down there in the little church just across the yard here, and they'd get the wood and they'd pile the wood in the stove and they'd get it. And even then, the dedication of the people. Can you imagine coming to church and having to wear a coat and gloves and staying here? No, today people would, I'm not, they forgot to pay their heating bill. I'm not going to go there. But the dedication of the people who were part of that original facility, I find it amazing. I'm a lover of history. I'm really a lover of history. And your friend Betty and Chuck, we were talking, and she was telling us that she was at a thing where she was wearing a hoop skirt and telling history. I was like, that is so cool. I told her that James is a big history major, and I said, one of the things that Pam did a great job in teaching our kids a love of books. They love to read. They didn't get that from me, but they got that from Pam. And even James loves to read. But another thing that I love about our kids is that they're great fans of history. Not only American history and world history, but of Christian history. And I love that. I'm a big fan of history because we need to remember where we came from, and that's why we celebrate 80 years. But today, in a way, today we stand just as the Israelites did in Joshua, stood on the west bank of the Jordan River. Today, several weeks after our 80th anniversary, we stand on the west bank, so to speak. And we saw what God has done in our midst. And now we ask the question, much like they probably did when they camped at Gilgal. The Israelites were probably, okay, Joshua, what's next? And some of you are saying, okay, Pastor Dale, what's next? Now what? Well, they were commanded to possess the land. Like I said, the story of Joshua is one of my favorite stories in the Bible. The story of the Joshua generation is amazing, really. Because the Joshua generation, except for two black marks on their time, was the sin of Achan and then the deception of the Gibeonites. But except for those two things, the Joshua generation did exactly what God wanted them to do. And they followed God with all of their heart, mind, soul, and strength. The Joshua generation was able to do what the previous generation was not able to do, and that was to occupy the land. They are obedient to their leader. They follow hard after the Lord's will. It's interesting to note that right after the end of in Joshua chapter 5, immediately after crossing the Jordan, the one thing that Joshua does is circumcises all the males, because they hadn't been circumcising since they left the land of Egypt. So for 40 years, so all the males had to be circumcised. Also, immediately following the cross of the Jordan, for 40 years, the Israelites had not celebrated the Passover because of their disobedience. The first thing that Joshua does when they cross over into the land that God promised them, guess what? Is to reinstate the Passover. To remember, and that's what the Passover is all about, is to remember the night that God passed over the Israelites. This will be the generation that seizes Jericho. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho. This will be the generation that occupies the land of Canaan. And it's the same question that I believe God is asking of us. Where do we go from here? Now I want to say that I've heard stories. I was really glad that I wasn't able to write the last part of this last couple paragraphs of the sermon until last night, because in the last couple of days I've heard stories of people who have been praying about how God can use them. People here at McCraybrook. How can God use me? How can I be a servant of God? And how can I help facilitate the next great movement of God here at McCraybrook? And that, when a pastor hears that, when a pastor hears that people have been praying for 5 new young families, when a pastor hears that I've been praying that I don't get in the way of where God is taking us, that makes a pastor's heart leap. I've heard stories of how people are asking God to show them who to invite for Back to Church Sunday. And I believe that as we pray for people and invite them to church, God will bring the increase. Now, one of the things I want to say is, here's the part. Here's the great part. Dan and I were talking on, what day was that? Monday or Tuesday, whatever day, it just kept coming down in buckets. I mean, it was just raining like crazy. And he goes, I got a great idea for Back to Church Sunday. I'm like, what's that? He goes, I know how you've been talking about this football, having a football Sunday and everybody wearing their football gear. And he goes, what if we combine Back to Church Sunday with a football Sunday and then have a tailgate picnic afterward? Great idea. Because that way, when people say, well, what do I wear to your church? Wear the jersey of your favorite football team, whether it's pro or college. Just come as you are. Come in jeans and your football shirt. And we'll have worship together. And guess what? You don't even have to worry about what to eat because our church is going to provide the food for after dinner, for after church. The preacher will try to keep it short. I'm going to try to keep it short that morning, but we're going to hear a gospel message. People are going to hear the love of Jesus, and they're going to hear how important it is to be part of the family of God. But I want you to start. So that's kind of like the big announcement. I didn't want to do it during the announcements because I wanted you to see how it all fit in with the message. So, and believe it or not, Pastor Dale is probably going to end up wearing a Bills shirt. Not even an Eagles shirt, because it's a little too far to drive to Philadelphia to get an Eagles shirt. Although I could probably get one on Amazon. But anyway, and be inviting friends. This is really important. This is a big deal. As we talk about reaching out to new people, as we talk about trying to go to a new place, to be somewhere we've never done before. Because one of the things I want is the admonition, because what happened is the Israelites built the memorial, right? But if they had just stayed there, they would have never conquered the land. And so we had our 80th anniversary. Hey, this was really cool. This was really cool to make a big deal about this. But God is calling us to possess the land. The Israelites only possessed a small portion of what God really had for them. And I don't want us to miss out. The Israel, what happened? What happened to the Joshua generation? They didn't, as much as I love the Joshua generation, they didn't finish the task. They left people in the land of Canaan. And what happened? Those people pulled them away from God. I mean, can you imagine if Joshua's generation would have occupied that big land that was Turkey and Iraq and the Jordan and Lebanon and Saudi Arabia and Egypt? Can you imagine what a difference that would have made in the way the world is today? Think about that. If that would have all been the nation of Israel, I suppose it could have made a huge difference. And so I don't want us, and like I said last week, I love you guys, and I've been praying for you guys, and I pray for myself. And one of the things that I want us as McCraybrook to do is reach our full potential. I don't want us to leave any potential left on the table. And I know some of you are saying, But Pastor, I'm getting old. Like I said last week, my friend Ken Nash up at Watermark Wesleyan, he says, if you have a pulse, you have a purpose. Right? If you have a pulse, you have a purpose. There's something that you can do. You can pray. And so here's the challenge this morning. I hope this 3x5 card, the one that you filled out, is on your refrigerator door. And that, or in your Bible, or wherever you do your devotions, you're continuing to pray for 5 families. Now you might think, well, Pastor, you put another 3x5 card in our bulletin today. Yes, I did. Actually, Pastor Pam did. But we've got some needs. Some, you know, as we think about, especially as we think about back to church Sunday, and as we think about moving and growing, what are some of the things that we need? Well, one of the things is we really don't need ushers. I mean, Jeff has done a good job of making sure that we have ushers. So that's kind of, if you want to be an usher, you can say, so what you need to do on this card is you need to put your name on it. And then I'm going to put 3 things up here. Ushers is one of them. If you want to be an usher, go ahead and say, I want to be an usher. The second one is greeters. Remember last week I told the story of going to the McKean County Fair and trying to help Pam and Anna put their exhibits in the fair? And it was just like, I have no idea. Like, okay, we're figuring out this one step at a time. And I think the funniest was when we got to the fair office. And Pam and Anna paid their money, and the lady just hands us a packet. And we just stood there. Because I'm like, what do you do now? Well, guess what? I said, I'm sorry, this is our first time here. Can you tell us what we do next? Well, you know what? When somebody walks through that door, when they walk through that double door at the bottom where they come up the handicap ramp and come in, coming to churches can be a scary place, especially if you've never been to church. So one of the best things to do is bring that person to church. If they're not a person who normally comes to church, bring them to church. But if you do invite them and they come on their own, it'd probably be a good idea for us to have greeters there at the door. So they can say, hey, welcome to McCraybrook. I'm an introvert, and I can't even do that. Hey, welcome to McCraybrook, you know? And hand them a bulletin and say, hey, well, we're so glad that you're here. And then just stick around back in the lobby for the first 10, 15 minutes, just in case because you know people are late. People like to come late. And so just be ready for any stragglers coming. So that's the first of 2 options. You can be an usher, you can be a greeter. And the last one is, if we're going to be a church that is praying for young families, guess what else we're going to need? We're going to need some people to be ready to go into the nursery. Now here's my plan. Here's my plan. If we can have 1 greeter per week for 4 weeks, that means you only have to serve once a month. That means all the rest of the weeks you get to sit down here and be part of the activities. If you're in the nursery, if we get at least 4 people for the nursery, that means you only have to be in the nursery once every month. And only when if you see a young family coming in, get up and go and go say, hey, if you need nursery, I'm here, and I'll take that child downstairs for you. So that's what we need. If we're going to be attractive to young, new families, those are the kinds of things we need. So this morning, as we get ready to sing, as we sing Have Thine Own Way, Lord, I want you to fill out the card, and then I probably need somebody to just take an offering plate and have everybody put their cards in that. So let's sing Have Thine Own Way together.